as you know, it's Martin Luther King Day here in the U.S., but for many Americans, especially younger Americans, the civil rights leader is more than a historical footnote. He's really just a man at the center of what was a very turbulent time in the U.S. history. Our next guest believes many Americans have a case of historical amnesia, as he calls it, when it comes to Dr. Martin Luther King. Joining us now to talk about that is Professor Yohuru Williams. He's Director of Black Studies at Fairfield University. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
We were just talking during the commercial break that most Americans, especially younger Americans, may not know the significance of Dr. Martin Luther King's contribution to American history. Give us an overview for those who don't.
Well, for most Americans, Dr. King exists in a soundbite, and it comes from the I Have a Dream speech. And really what we do is distill an entire life and an entire movement down to a couple of words that are uttered at what is perhaps the greatest moment of that movement, but certainly not indicative of the entire protest struggle that was the civil rights movement. So we want to celebrate people like Dr. King, like Rosa Parks, for their contribution, but we want to understand this was a very large social movement that addressed the issues of separate but equal in America at that time.
You know what's interesting, and I lived through part of that as well, that he was also vehemently against the Vietnam War and bumped up against the White House because of that. President Johnson did not care for his stance on that. But that was one of the other things he discussed. It wasn't always civil rights and rights for African Americans, was it?
No, not at all. Dr. King was opposed to the Vietnam War, and toward the close of his life, actually in the last few years of his life, he was dedicated to anti-poverty. In his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, Dr. King articulates the idea that what good is it to have the right to eat in a restaurant if you can't afford anything on the menu? Civil rights without economic justice are dead rights. And so in a lot of ways, when we look at something like Occupy Wall Street, Dr. King would have been very much supportive of those types of ideas.
We are decades from his passing, his assassination. We are decades from the I Have a Dream speech. I think this year is the 50th anniversary of that speech. Do most Americans in general know who Martin Luther King is? You're around young students all day long at Fairfield University. Do most of them know who he is and who he was?
They know him in some sense as almost as a caricature of himself. And I say that because he exists, as so many leaders do, in a kind of cookie-cutter boxed image, and they don't look at the totality of his experience. This is someone who wrote 3 books and who at the end of his life, we tend to think of Dr. King as very charismatic and very popular, had actually alienated a lot of his supporters. A lot of people didn't agree with his position on Vietnam. A lot of people didn't agree with his position on poverty. And so here was somebody who believed in the strength of his convictions and was willing to stand up for what he believed in. And that's important. And young people, I think, the takeaway for in looking at someone like Dr. King is the strength of character, in addition to what he did with regard to civil rights.
In our polarized society, with so much media out there, and back then there were 3 major networks and that was it, and there was one nightly newscast on each of them. Do you think Dr. King would thrive in an environment like this today, talking about economic issues, talking about race?
I think it's interesting because technology, there's so much scrutiny applied now that the type of charismatic leadership that we saw even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the Malcolm X's, the Martin Luther Kings, I don't know that they would be able to exist in this news cycle, under this degree of scrutiny. Having said that, it doesn't mean that there aren't people who are making those types of connections, and it's not necessary that we continue to talk about these issues: housing, inequality, healthcare. These are all things that Dr. King talked about that were important to him.
Well, when you talk about the economic issues of today, we mentioned the media as well, there's internet and there's blogs and so on and so forth. Do you think those who were opposed to him then, if he were alive today, would have much bigger voice and maybe drown out his charismatic personality, drown out his message by sheer force of numbers?
I think what we would see is a situation where you'd have Dr. King looking at using that same technology, that same media, in the same way that Barack Obama did to win the presidency in 2008. But I think that's part of the problem. Is the assumption is, especially when we talk about race, that the culmination of this movement was to elect a black man and put him in the White House. Dr. King was far more diverse in his thinking than that. It was issues of economic justice, issues of economic equality that also dominated that message, that he saw at the core of the racial issues as well.
How do you, for this generation and for generations to follow, convey to them the significance of Martin Luther King when time has passed? Let's grant it, time has passed. We talk about World War II, it's so long ago, it's still significant. And Dr. Martin Luther King was definitely significant. But how do you convey to this generation his importance?
I think you look at him and you talk about him taking on the difficult issues of his day. And you try to use him as a means to inspire young people to think about the problems that exist in our society presently and how they can make a difference. MLK Day has become a national day of service, and what people want to do is encourage people to go out and emulate Dr. King by getting involved in their communities. That's the first step, understanding that this was someone who, at his core, cared deeply about his fellow human being and was willing to serve others.
Dr. Yohuru Williams, I apologize for the flub there, from Fairfield University. We thank you so much.
Great seeing you.
Really interesting and an education of sorts of what he was all about, because I had forgotten as well, and we discussed it during the commercial, that indeed he was against the Vietnam War. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks again.